The tension had been building for weeks inside Donovan State Prison. Suge Knight, a figure who had once ruled the streets and music industry, now found himself stuck in a place where power was constantly shifting. His past battles in the free world were nothing compared to what he had to face now. Prison life was a game, and in that game, there were always men looking to knock you off the throne. For Sue, the danger was never far away, and it was about to escalate in a way no one could have predicted. Suge had always been a dominant force, not just on the outside, but within the prison walls. Even though he was incarcerated, the power he held over certain factions in prison was undeniable. His own reputation preceded him. Respected by some, feared by many, but there was one man. One gang leader who had been watching Sue for months. This man had his own power in the prison, his own following, and he wasn't going to sit back and let Suge Continuetto control the narrative. The two of them were on a one-collision course, and there was no stopping it now. It started with small interactions. Words exchanged in the yard, eye contact in the missal, little things that set the stage for the storm that was brewing. The gang leader was no stranger to violence. He had made a name for himself through force, intimidation, and strategic manipulation. In prison, that was the currency that mattered. But he wasn't the only one who knew how to play the game. For Suga, the tension wasn't new. He had been in high-stakes situations his entire life, but this felt different. There was something in the air, something unspoken that made him feel like he was being cornered. It wasn't just about fighting it for survival anymore. It was about respect. The rules of the prison were simple. If you didn't maintain control, if you didn't prove that you were untouchable, someone else would take over. The whispers about a confrontation started to grow louder. Some inmates sided with Sugu, others with the gang leader, and the rest simply watched the drama unfold. The tension between the two men was now a battle for dominance, and it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. Suge wasn't just going to give up. His influence in Thepperson without a fight. His reputation had been built on the memory he instilled in others. He wasn't about to let some gang leader take that away from him, not without a price. The prison guards had noticed the growing animosity, but hadn't done anything to intervene. After all, this was part of the game. They couldn't step in until it got violent. And with both of these men involved, it was only a matter of time for that happened. But what the guards didn't realize was that Suge Knight wasn't just another inmate. He wasn't Eamon who could be controlled by anyone, not even the prison system. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss another incredible story like this. Now, let's get back to it. As the days passed, the anticipation of the inevitable confrontation grew. Both men knew it was coming, and the question wasn't if it would happen. It was, and when the entire prison had become a powder keg, and all it would take was a single spark to set it off, for Suge, it wasn't just about winning. It was about sending a message. He needed to show everyone inside that he was still in charge, that no one could take his throne without paying the price. The tension reached its peak one morning in the yard. Suge and the gang leader locked eyes from across the field. And in that instant, everything else in Thepperson seemed to fade away. The inmates, the guards, the noise. It all disappeared as if the world was holding its breath. This wasn't just another fight. This was the battle for the Sulof Donovan State Prison. And no one, not even Suge Knight, could predict how it would end. Everything was set, the stage was ready. The question wasn't whether Suge would fight. It was how far he was willing to go to prove that he was still the man who ruled this place. The real fight was about to begin, and no one inside the prison would ever be the same again. As the days passed, the tension in Donovan State Prison only seemed to grow. Suge Knight was no stranger to conflict, but the situation he found himself in now felt different. The gang leader, a man with a reputation for brutal violence and ruthless control, had become an undeniable threat to Suga's reign. There were rumors in the prison that this gang leader was planning something, but no one was sure exactly what. The word on the street was that he was coming for Sue, and it wouldn't be long before everything boiled over. Suge wasn't one to let his guard down. He'd spent years in prison using his power and influence to control the inmates around him. But as time passed, he started to realize that the landscape was shifting. The gang leader wasn't just another inmate looking for his shot at power. He was someone who understood the game on a deeper level, and that made him more dangerous than any adversary Sue had faced before. The gang leader had been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew the value of patience, and he'd carefully built his own alliances inside the prison. Word spread quickly, and soon Suge began to hear whispers that the gang leader was rallying his supporters, agonizing an attack. It wasn't just about taking down Suge. It was about taking over the prison itself. The gang leader wasn't just looking for a fight. He was looking for total control. Suge, always the strategist, wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for it to happen. He had his own loyal followers in the prison, people who would follow him to the end. But the reality was he wasn't as untouchable as Heon's thought. The fear he commanded wasn't the same as it used to be. The prison was a place of constant shifting allegiances, and Suge was beginning to see cracks in his Aina empire. The gang leader wasn't afraid of Suge, and that made him more dangerous than anyone Suge had ever encountered before. Despite all of this, Suge knew what he had to do. He wasn't about to let someone else take control of the prison. He had built his reputation on being a man who could not destroy anyone who challenged him, and that reputation wasn't something he was willing to lose. The stakes had never been higher. Suge understood that if he didn't act soon, he could very well lose everything. It wasn't long before a confrontation was inevitable that a gang leader's men started making their presence known, and there were increasingly hostile encounters between the two factions. Suge was a mortem of intimidation, but he knew this wouldn't be a battle-heckled win with fear alone. The gang leader was a different breed, a man how isn't afraid to play dirty. Could he unuse violence to settle scores? The prison guards began to notice the rising tension, but they couldn't step in. Not yet. This was prison life, and fights were part of the day-to-day. There were shakedowns. There were scuffles. There was showdowns. They all blended into the fabric of the institution. But this was different. The player's house involved were too dangerous. You're in the consequences too high. Everyone inside the prison could feel it. Something big was coming, and it wouldn't end until one of the tollmen was standing at the top. It wasn't long before the prison yard became the hotspot wickfuck of the growing feud. Sug single quotes S. Knight and the gang leader had locked eyes one too many times, each man sizing the other up, waiting for the other to make a move. And then the confrontation everyone had been waiting for finally happened. In the yard, it started with a verbal spat. Words exchanged, harsh threats thrown back and forth. The kind of heated exchange that made every inmate pause to listen, but neither man was about to back down. The air was thick with the scent of violence, and soon it escalated into something much darker. Suge and the gang leader fist each other. Fists raised, and the prison seemed to hold its breath. The fight wasn't just about physical dominance. It was about control, about asserting that the prison would belong to one of them and the other would be broken before anyone could react. Chaos erupted. The sounds of grunts, slams, and shouts filled the yard. Suge fought fiercely, using everything at his disposal, strength, experience, and his reputation. But the gang leader was equally as vicious, landing blows that sent shock waves through Suge's body. It wasn't just a brawl. It was a battle for survival, one that neither man could afford to lose. Suge's face contorted in pain as he took a hard hit, the kind that left a mark. His body ached, but his will was stronger. This was the kind of fight that could determine everything. But even as the fight raged on, one question lingered in the back of his mind. Was this his final stand? Or could still outmaneuver his rival? Even from the edge of defeat? The answer would come soon enough. The fight was far from over, and the repercussions would echo through the halls of Donovan State Prison for a long time. The fight between Suge Knight and the gang leader had ignited the entire prison. The air was thick with anticipation as inmates crowded around eager to witness the battle of the two most powerful figures in the yard. The sound of fists slamming against flesh echoed in the open space, a brutal reminder of the stakes at play. This wasn't just a fight for dominance, it was a fight for survival. And both men knew that their reputations were on the line. Suge Knight, despite the years spent in prison, was still the beast he had always been. His muscular build and raw strength were his weapons, and used them with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. He swung with everything he had, his blows landing with the kind of force that could leave a man reeling for days. But the gang leader was no slouch. He was just as ruthless, just as determined. Every punch, every kick he delivered was meant to break Suge mentally and physically. The gang leader had the upper hand for a moment, his fists landing in rapid succession. Suge staggered, his breath coming in ragged gusts as the pain shot through his ribs. His vision blurred, but he refused to fall. He couldn't afford to. This fight wasn't just about brute strength. It was about sending a message. Suge wasn't second of man to back down. If he did, it wouldn't just be him losing. It would be loss for everything he had built, his empire, his influence, his legacy. With a growl, Suge pushed through the pain. He knew that if he didn't turn the tide of this fight, his influence in the prison would be shattered. He launched a counterattack, using his wrestling skills to bring the gang leader to the ground. There was a moment of struggle. Both men grappling with all their might, the fight becoming less about technique and more about who could outlast the other. But it wasn't enough. The gang leader was relentless, and he had wobbed back Suge into a corner. The blows continued to rain down on Suge, each one landing harder than the last. The crowd of inmates watched in a mixture of awe and fear. They knew the stakes. Suge Knight was the king of the prison. But every king had a challenger. As the fight raged on, it was clear that neither man was willing to give up, but Suge could feel his energy slipping. The gang leader's onslaught was relentless. His arms felt like lead, and each breath was harder to catch. But in the chaos, Suge's mind raced. He needed to get back on top, and knew there was only one way to do it. Suge grabbed the gang leader by the shoulders, pulling him in close. With a sudden, powerful shift, Suge turned the fight back in his favor. He brought his knee up into the gang leader's midsection, knocking the wind out of him. The gang leader staggered backward, his body heaving as he gasped for air. Suge wasn't done. Adrenaline runs through his veins. He charged forward, pushing the gang leader back against the fence with a final-devastating blow. Suge knocked his opponent to the ground. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others watching in stunned silence. Suge stood over the gang leader, his chest heaving, blood dripping down his face, but he didn't care. He had won. He had proven that no one, not even the most dangerous man in prison, could take his crown. His body ached, but his heart was still unbroken. But the fight didn't end there. The aftermath of this violent confrontation was just beginning. As the guards arrived and broke up the fight, Suge was dragged away, bleeding and barely able to stand. But there was no fear in his eyes, no sign of weakness. He had survived. And that's what Suge Knight did best. Survived. What happened next would change everything. As Suge was escorted back to his cell, his body bruised and battered, he knew that this fight wasn't just about physical domination. It was about showing the entire prison that no one could ever take his throne. The world had underestimated him once again. And no, even in his weakened state, Suge had made it clear that he was not to be messed with. The gang leader, lying in a heap on the ground, was taken away to be patched up. But Suge didn't need to see the man again. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. Inside those walls, Suge Knight was still the king, and no one could take that from him. Not now, not ever. But as the dust began to settle, one question remained. Would the gang leader let this humiliation slide? Or would this fight spark a war that no one could control? As Sue lay on his bunk in the infirmary, recovering from the fight, the answer to that question seemed inevitable. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The aftermath of the fight left Donovan State Prison buzzing with tension. Suge Knight had survived, But his victory over the gang leader wasn't as simple as it seemed. Inside the prison walls, everything had shifted. While Suge stood tall, his body bruised and battered, there was something far more dangerous on the horizon. The not consequences of his actions. Suge's reputation was once again solidified, but there were cracks appearing in the prison's power structure. The gang leader was defeated, but he wasn't broken. The fight may have been over for now, but there were far-reaching effects from this brutal clash. For the inmates who had witnessed the entire event, the story was just beginning. Some saw Suge as the main unstoppable force, the man who could never be brought down. But there were others who saw his victory as just the beginning of something bigger, a battle for dominance that wasn't over. In the days that followed, the news of the fight spread like wildfire. Throughout the prison, whispers filled the hallways and cell blocks as the inmates speculated on what was going to happen next. Some wondered if the gang leader would come back with a vengeance, gathering his followers for a second round. Others believed that Suge's victory had cemented his place as the near-disputed king off the yard. But it wasn't just the other inmates who were watching. The guards were as the prison. Officials and even the higher-ups in the correctional system were taking notice. Suge's unyielding will to dominate in the face of adversity wasn't something they had seen before. They couldn't control him like they could with other inmates. No matter how much they tried to break him, Suge found a way to rise above it. The fight itself had been brutal, but it was the aftermath one that sent shock waves through the prison. Suge, now recovering from his injuries in the infirmary, had approved it, or something that no one could deny. He was still a force to be reckoned with. He was never going to be just another inmate in the system. He was a man who could war-shape the prison with a single move. Yet, Suge knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he lay in his hospital bed, his body stitched up and swollen, he couldn't shake the thought that the Hagang leader would be back. He wasn't sure when, but he was certain that the man who had challenged him wouldn't take his defeat lying down. If anything, it would fuel the fire. 3 of the already volatile tensions within the prison. It wasn't just about a single fight anymore. The entire prison was caught in a game of power, and Suge was still in the center of it. His loyalty to his crew and his command over the other inmates had been severely tested. But there was one thing that was absolutely clear. Suge Knight would not be dethroned. As the days passed, the gang leader remained in the shadows, licking his wounds in W. Shinmen, plotting his next move. Suge knew that the gang leader wouldn't stop until Hare claimed his pride and pro-term position. But Suge wasn't going to let that happen. He was already planning his next move, knowing full well that he couldn't afford to let this fight define him. The prison's power struggle had only just begun, and it would take more than a few punches to take Suge down. The question remained, would Suge continue to rule the prison, or would the Wood Gang leader rise again with the strength of his followers? The balance of power was delicate, but for now, Suge knew that he still had the edge. He was wounded, but he wasn't defeated, and in prison, that was all that mattered. The battle lines had been drawn, and the only thing Suge could do now was prepare for what came next. No one was safe, and in this prison, nothing was ever truly over. The days after the fight felt like a slow burn, each passing hour weighing heavier than the last. Suge Knight had been through countless battles in his life. But this time, there was something different in the air. He wasn't just recovering from physical injuries. He was dealing with the reality that for the first time he had shown vulnerability. Suge Knight, the man who had ruled the streets and the prison yard with an iron fist, was now in a position where he had to prove himself all over again. And the stakes had never been higher. In the isolation of the infirmary, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the fluorescent lights, Suge's mind raced. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not in front of Fanyan. The last thing he wanted was to become a target. The one thing he had always worked so hard to avoid. He had made enemies before, but this was different. This wasn't about more business about building an empire. This was about survival. And the prison with all its politics wasn't playing by any rules Suge had ever followed. Outside the infirmary, whispers were growing louder. Word of Suga's fight with the gang leader had spread like wildfire. Everyone's mind was talking about it. Inmates who had bowed to his authority now looked at him with a different kind of curiosity. There was no doubt that Suge was still Suge Knight. But in the eyes of the prison, his invincibility was now in question, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. The gang leader, while battered and bruised, was far from done. He might have lost the fight, but there was no way he would let Suge get away with humiliating him in front of the anti-repressant. Suge knew the man well enough to understand that his defeat had been just a setback, nothing more. There would be retaliation. The question was, how would it come? The gang leader had allies on the inside just like Suge, and Suge hadn't a doubt that his enemy would rally his troops in an attempt to reclaim his position. The prison was a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before the fuse was lit. As Suge lay there, the adrenaline of the fight slowly leaving his system, he realized that he couldn't wait for the next strike. He couldn't afford to let the gang leader have the upper hand again. The next move had to be his, and it had to be devastating. He wasn't about to let anyone take away the power he had fought so hard to maintain. This wasn't just about pride. This was about control. Suge had to show the entire prison that even when pushed to the brink, he was still the one in charge. The next day, he demanded to see one of his closest allies in the prison, a man who had helped him hold his power for years. Suge was still severely injured, but his mind was sharp. The pain was a reminder of what was at stake. A constant buzz in the background as he plotted his next move. When his ally entered the room, Suge wasted no time. "We're not done here." His voice was low, but the danger in it was clear. The fight was just the beginning. There was a lot more chess to be played, and Suge wasn't going to lose this game. The plan was set in motion. Suge's ally was sent to deliver a message to the Maver gang leader crew. A warning among promise that this wasn't over. The gang leader might have humiliated Sue in front of the whole prison, but now it was time for Sue to return the favor. The message was clear. "Come for me and you will regret it." Back in his cell, Suge leaned back, allowing the coolness of the metal bars to settle his mind. He couldn't move freely yet, not with the state of his injuries, but heckled still maneuver. From within. The most dangerous thing about Suge Knight wasn't his physical strength. It was his mind and how well he could orchestrate his next move. The entire prison was waiting for the next chapter. Would Sue rise again, or would he be overthrown? But Sue wasn't focused on the outside world right now. No, his focus was internal. He knew that if he was going to keep control, he had to take back the narrative. Suge Knight wasn't done. He never was. The prison had underestimated him for too long, and no, as he lay in his cell recovering, he prepared to show them all just how wrong they were. This fight wasn't just a struggle for power. It was his fight for dominance. And Suge Knight never let anyone take his throne. Not without a fight. The tension was palpable. The storm was coming. The prison walls seemed to pulse with an energy that couldn't be ignored. Suge Knight's body was still healing from the brutal fight. The wounds slowly mending, but the real battle was just beginning. The gang leader, still licking his wounds, was preparing for his own retaliation. But the one thing no one seemed to fully grasp was that Suge had always been the Manar mastermind. While his body was healing, his mind was sharper than ever. The question wasn't if he could reclaim his throne in Theprison. The question was how long it would take for the others to realize he was still in control. Every step Suge took in the prison now felt like a calculation. He wasn't rushing anything. He was letting the war rumors were a swirl, letting the prisoners gossip about what would happen next. He knew how to let the tension build, how to use it as a weapon. The more the gang leader crew assumed they had the upper hand, the more Suge could maneuver. Patience, something Suge had always had in abundance, was going to be his greatest weapon now. But the prison was changing. The prisoners could feel it. The uncertainty, the shifting of power. Those who had supported Suge began to question if he could still hold on. And those who had once been loyal to the gang leader started to sense that their leader might not be the unbeatable force he thought he was. The balance of power in the prison was fragile, and Suge was positioning himself, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Days turned into weeks, and the growing tension reached its peak. Suge's enemies, or began to notice that something was off. He wasn't the defeated man they had hoped for. He wasn't hiding or lying low. Instead, he was quietly rebuilding, carefully selecting who would stand with him and who would be left to wither. His reputation as a master manipulator was still intact, and he wasn't going to lose it. Then the moment came. The gang leader, emboldened by his followers, made the mistake of thinking he had Suge cornered. He believed fat with enough muscle, he could finally end Suge's reign once and for all. But what the gang leader didn't know was that Suge had already put his final plan T into motion. Suge knew this wouldn't be settled with a simple fight. He knew that the only way to fully reclaim power was to make his move public, to show through whole prison that Duru he was still the king. It wasn't about bloodied anymore. It was about mind games, about controlling the prison from behind scenes, and letting everyone see that no one else could challenge him. It started when Suge's crew made their move, spreading word that Suge was ready to face the gang leader. Not in a fight to the death, but in front of everyone. The confrontation will be public. And Suge's strategy was simple. Intimidation. He didn't need to fight again. All he needed was to reassert his control. The day of the confrontation arrived, and the tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. Inmates gathered in a massive circle surrounding Suge and the gang leader. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the final shouting. But as the two men locked eyes, something shifted. The gang leader, brimming with arrogance, saw Suge standing there, a picture of calm confidence. The intensity in Suge's gaze was enough to stop him in his tracks. Suge stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate. He didn't need to say much. His presence, the sheer power he commanded, was all anyone needed to see. In the silence that followed, the gang leader hesitated, unsure of what to do. Suge had already won. The power dynamics had shifted in his favor. Hadn't need to swing out a fist or make a bold declaration. He simply had toasted there and let the fear do the rest. The gang leader followers, once so sure of their leader's strength, began to lose confidence. The whispers started, the eyes shifting, and Suge knew it was over. The fight was never about the physical confrontation. It was about proving to everyone in Kiripin, including himself, that Suge Knight could never be broken, and just like that, the tension in the prison broke. The gang leader backed down, his followers reluctantly stepping aside. Suge had won without ever lifting a finger. It wasn't about the physical victory. It was about dominating the psychological war, and showing that no matter how much the world tried to puff him down, Suge could never be dethroned. As Suge turned to walk away, his mind was already racing. This was just one victory in a long game, but it was the victory. He needed to remind everyone that the rules were still his to make. The fight in the yard had been just a glimpse of the power struggle to come. The real battle was in who could control everything behind the scenes. And in the end, there was only one king in that prison, and his name was Suge Knight. As Suge walked back to his cell, still bruised but undefeated, the prison knew one thing for sure. Suge Knight was still the man to beat, and no one could take his place. The game wasn't over. It had just begun.